Soon, transgender students will be allowed to use restrooms that reflect their gender identity. In fact, GDOE has to comply with this recent federal guideline in order to continue receiving millions of dollars in federal grants. PNC's Rosal Romanes reports.
The Guam Department of Education has 2 months to comply with federal guidelines related to ensuring that transgender students are not discriminated against, or else their department may lose a chance of receiving $25 million in federal funding.
Every year when we apply for a federal grant, like our consolidated grant, which is $25 million to the government, to our department, we have to sign assurances that we are complying with all the federal requirements, including Title IX. So this year, when we sign on the line, we're saying that we're complying with that requirement to ensure access to restroom facilities for transgender students. So that's the guidance. If we don't want to assure the federal government, there is a possibility that we will not be able to access those federal funds.
According to GDOE Superintendent John Fernandez, under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, schools receiving federal money may not discriminate based on a student's sex. That means GDOE must treat students consistent with their gender identity, even if their school records or identification documents indicate a different sex, allow students to participate in sex-segregated activities and access sex-segregated facilities consistent with their gender identity, and protect students' privacy related to their transgender status.
Some people think that when you have a male, boys' restroom, girls' restroom, and then you create a transgender restroom, that's compliance. But that's not how I interpret the guidance. The guidance is basically if you have a boy or girl restroom, the transgender student should be able to access the bathroom based on his or her gender identity.
Fernandez explains that transgender students would have to register themselves as transgenders at their respective schools.
It requires that transgender students identify and register at the school. So it's not just you can go in and say, hey, I identify as a girl, I identify as a boy. You really have to identify yourself as a transgender student and establish your gender identity with the administrator so that they're able then to ensure that there's proper access provided.
Fernandez says during their next work session with the Guam Education Board, they will be reviewing the federal guidance, coming up with policies, and making plans on how to implement the policies at the schools. On top of that, GDOE would need to get feedback from stakeholders as well.
I think the most important thing is that we get feedback from the community. So I ran a Twitter poll trying to get student input. We had about 60% of those respondents, which are over 1,000 respondents, indicating that they agree with the federal guidelines. There were about 20% who said that they disagreed, and then there were another 20% who were up in the air and unsure.
GDOE is pressed for time as they only have 6 weeks to comply with the guidelines.
At that point, I would hope that we've resolved this issue internally, that we're all in agreement about the expectations and what it means to implement and comply with Title IX. With regard to transgender students, and then so I can sign confidently on that assurance line.
Rosal Romanes, PNC News.